everybody. I'm here today with Zachary Elliott, who is the founder of the Paradox Institute, a research group that specializes in teaching the biology of sex and sex differences to the public. Zach has been researching, reading, and writing about sex differences since 2017. He's written 3 books on the subject. His most recent one is Binary: Debunking the Sex Spectrum Myth. And he's also a writer and producer of more than 20 animated videos on the biology of sex. So Zachary, thank you so much for joining me. It's our second podcast together, and it's been a couple of years, so I want to hear more about the work you've been doing and everything. And I thought maybe just to jump right in with the conversation today, I would put to you a thought that I had while I was reading your book and see what you think. You know, when I was reading it, you were talking about how all the different sex characteristics of a male or a female, it's all part of a system, right? So it's not just random that a woman has, certain parts, breasts, and all those different things. It's part of a system that connects, which is for the purpose of reproduction, of course. So a thought struck me while I was reading that might actually be something that's helpful to people struggling with gender dysphoria, to read that. It's sort of this neutral idea that your body is for the system. It takes out kind of all the high pressure social and psychological ideas that go into it. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and I enjoyed reading your book, and I thought it could be helpful for even that purpose. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, a big part of the sex spectrum idea is that our bodies are just these independent components of parts that can be interchanged at will, that we can just use medicine to just kind of take away this part, put in this part, and everything will be fine. But in reality, as anybody who studies biology or medicine knows, our bodies are entire systems, and our organs are systems. Our organs interact with each other for overarching functions. Our entire nervous system works together through our brain, through our entire body. Our entire reproductive system is a bunch of components that work together for a function of producing gametes and gestating offspring if you're a female, and things like that. And so if somebody who has gender dysphoria can really realize and understand that, oh, my body is actually not something that I can just change these parts at will. It's actually this complex system, and I could really damage myself if I actually start to try and edit this complex system. And even with all the knowledge that we have in medicine, there's many aspects to pumping artificial hormones into your body that are not at the level that your body is basically evolved or designed for through development. In regards to hormones, like pumping those cross-sex hormones in, it's going to mess up that complex system that's been developed there since you developed in the womb. And so I think it's really helpful to actually view these basically your body parts as complex systems, because we couldn't actually treat people accurately if we didn't understand how all those systems work together.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's another point you made in the book, that we need to understand male and female in order to even understand how to deal with people who have gender dysphoria. And
yes.
Do you remember the first time you ever heard about the sex spectrum myth?
Yeah, it was, I think, in probably 2017, 2016. Before I started writing about sex differences, I saw it start to pop up in the same time that just the trans debate started really going into the mainstream on colleges and things like that. And I was in college at the time in 2016, 2017. And that's when I saw this weird idea that male and female are one on this spectrum. There's this spectrum of sexes, or spectrum of variations between male and female, and then on top of that male and female are socially constructed, that they're not categories that are based in biology. And then on top of that gender identity, one's internal sense of self, they say, as feeling male or female or neither, that actually supersedes sex, and that is the ultimate determinant of sex, which, by the way, is basically a direct quote from Claire Ainsworth's Sex Redefined article in Nature magazine. One of the sex researchers said that gender identity makes, because there's no like parameter that overtakes any other parameter when it comes to defining sex, which is not true. He said that, oh well, gender identity is just the ultimate determinant of sex. So all of that stuff started popping up around that time, and that's where I really started to see this go off the rails. And it was very interesting, but also terrifying at the same time. So I went in and did a lot of research, and then, I eventually, as we've talked about before, in 2020 I formed the Paradox Institute, and then as a way to help dispel myths, help educate people on biology, but do so in like an accessible way that produces high quality like animated videos that look elegant and also provide the sources. So that's how all that started, and that's why I wrote the book Binary now. It's just a encapsulation of many of the arguments that I've made since 2020, since being on Twitter talking about this, and it also goes through 10 major sex spectrum arguments that you'll see. So whether it's sex redefined by Nature, whether it's stop using phony science to justify transphobia by Scientific American, whether it's Ann Fostow-Sterling's classic 1.7% intersex statistic. So it goes through all those in detail and just gives you the evolutionary and developmental biology literature to back up the biological reality of what's actually going on and to educate others and how to respond to those claims. So yeah, it's been a crazy ride since then, and we can go into more detail about like what I've done with the Paradox Institute and how that's developed since 2020. But yeah, I think if people return to understanding biology as systems, I think that would help a lot, because a lot of our thinking is not systems thinking. It's just basically like Mr. Potato Head type thinking. You just detach parts, and it's just, that is not healthy. It's not scientific. It's and it's resulted in a lot of damage to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in your book and in your other work with the Paradox Institute, you kind of help us make sense of the arguments that are being put forth, because they can confuse a lot of people, especially those of us who don't understand biology as well and don't understand what people are talking about when they're saying, well, there are 6 sexes because you can have XXY, or you can have all these different combinations. And so you really go through that in the book. I don't fully understand everything. Maybe you can help me, understand more as well today. But I also wanted to ask you, when you first started hearing about all that stuff about the sex spectrum, did you ever have a moment where you thought, oh, maybe this is an interesting new theory? Or did you always kind of think this is BS or this is a myth right from the start?
I really, because I went through basically quite a bit of biology education just through middle school and high school, and then I took a pre-AP high school biology course where we went through the many disorders that occur in humans that are like chromosomal disorders like XXY or X. And so we learned that, okay, people who have these chromosomal disorders, they still develop as males or females based on the reproductive system they develop. And we also learned a lot of detail about how reproductive systems work, how gametes are formed, how sperm creation happens, how egg creation happens. And with all that background, it was very clear to me that, okay, male and female are, not just chromosomes. It's not about that necessarily. It's much deeper in the sense of what the function of male and female are, which is in terms of reproduction and the type of gamete that you're providing. So even back then, I had that understanding. I didn't know the level of detail, obviously, that I do now, and I didn't even know the detailed arguments that these sex spectrum proponents make. And when I did start reading their arguments, I did start seeing all the different conditions they brought up. Sometimes it did stump me, because I was like, wow, this is a really complicated condition. Like, how do I make sense of this? And so that's why I also dug deeper into the biology literature into the developmental biology literature, and even the medical biology literature, and like reading about these conditions in detail, and also understanding what causes them, understanding how they develop. And so with that more detailed understanding, then I was able to say, okay, this is actually, even though maybe it's complicated, it is simpler than I thought. And reading all that scientific evidence helped me understand that basically a lot of these complicated conditions, once you really understand what's going on, it helps take away a lot of the power that these sex spectrum proponents have, because they rely on ignorance for it to work. They rely on the fact that, oh, this sounds super complex, and we don't really know all the details, and they purposely leave out details, either because they're ignorant or they're purposefully, like, just leaving out details because they're lying. But when you actually investigate those conditions, it becomes a lot clearer. And so, yeah, so I guess to answer your question, even though it did maybe stump me at times in terms of like, wow, what's going on with this condition? I mean, I always knew that what male and female were, and I also knew that chromosomal disorders, or just disorders in general, don't disprove the existence of the male and female sexes.
Yeah. So that's interesting. You had a lot of background in learning about this stuff in school, which for some of us in the U.S. education system, it's just, unfortunately passes us by, which maybe contributes to the problem as well. And I wanted to say, I remember when I first heard about the sex spectrum myth, which was, I was in college as well. And I was at a party talking to somebody, and it was this NYU grad student telling me, oh, sex is really it cannot be defined as just male or female. It's a spectrum, all these things. Yeah. And I already had heard about the transgender movement. I already knew that, they were trying to put forth the idea that like a man could be a woman if you put on heels and makeup. So I kind of knew this was BS, but I remember the student sending me an article after to try to like bolster his point. And it was about, it was a study about what you're describing, about how slight variations in the different traits between the sexes means that you really can't define either one as, I guess, the binary.
Right.
So,
right, like the fact that there's overlap, even, right, like certain traits might overlap. Like you might have a woman with very, very high testosterone compared to a typical woman. You might have a man with very, very, very low testosterone. And obviously now we actually do have cases where typical women with no disorder, are given super, super high male levels of T. And so they're trying to, they could argue in that case, oh, it's overlap there, so it's like a blurry divide. Well, they're still women for the reason that we know as, adult human females are defined, because they use like so many different traits. They'll just use behavior, for example, like expression. Oh, men and women have so much, there's like a spectrum of expression between them in terms of like how they can dress and everything, and what their interests are. And they'll say that, well, this is socially constructed because there's actually a whole spectrum in between, basically. And then I'll also go on to talk about secondary sex characteristics like breasts, facial hair, things that are like tied to sex, but they don't directly define sex. They'll say that that's a spectrum. And to a degree, it's true in the sense that there is spectrum of morphology in terms of like breast size, breast development in females. Some males might actually develop breast tissue due to a disorder as well, or due to, hormonal disorders. There's also a spectrum of facial hair. Some women, maybe due to high testosterone, they can grow facial hair like men can. Maybe not at the same level, but some who are taking, very, very high T can also grow facial hair. But again, that doesn't mean that they're somehow men or in between the sexes, because they're still women, because they have the reproductive system that's organized around egg production. It doesn't change that, right? And then they'll go even further and bring up traits like basically like, oh, chromosomes. So there's people who might have there's men who might have like 2 X chromosomes and 1 Y chromosome, Klinefelter syndrome. They'll bring that up and they'll say that, oh, there's overlap here because, oh, these men have 2 X chromosomes, just like how women typically have 2 X chromosomes. but it's like it doesn't define a new sex or anything. The men with Klinefelter syndrome, they their gonads differentiate into testes, they develop a penis, they have some level of sperm production, even though they're often infertile. And so it's like that doesn't make their point at all. It just shows you that there's one, disorders within the sexes, and two, that there's to a degree, when it comes to some traits, plenty of overlap between the sexes, just like there's overlap in certain traits between like apples and oranges. I mean, you can show overlap in really any category, in most categories in biology. It doesn't mean that those categories, because they have overlap, are somehow non-existent or socially constructed. Like they like to claim that because of all that overlap in men and women, that it's socially constructed, but it's a fallacy, because we're just showing like where men and women have traits in common. Like, for example, height or weight is a good one as well. If you plot height, for example, men's height values and women's height values, you'll get a distribution for males and then a distribution for females, and there will be quite a bit of overlap where they share traits in common. There's plenty of men who are 5'5", and plenty of women who are 5'5". But even though there's that overlap, you're still comparing two different categories, and so that's what's going on. They try to latch on to the fact that there's overlap in all these traits, but none of those traits define what sex is.
When it comes to the XXY males, what is that extra X doing?
So I'm not really sure exactly what it's doing. They might go through X inactivation, which happens in females, in typical females, where you have two X chromosomes in typical females, and what happens genetically is that randomly one of the X chromosomes in every cell, the genes on that X chromosome are silenced, because you don't want double gene dosage of all the gene products from the X chromosome. That would mean that females would have double gene products, whereas males would have just a single gene product from the X chromosome. So nature has figured out this way of basically making it equivalent, where the gene products from the X chromosome are equivalent in females and males. There's like a functional equivalence. Now, with Klinefelter syndrome, because they have the extra X, it likely does go through X inactivation. However, the problem is, I was actually reading about X inactivation recently, and when it comes to the second X chromosome that's inactivated, there are some genes on the X chromosome that escape X inactivation. There's certain genes that actually exist in double copy and actually function in terms of the gene products in double copy. For example, we know that women typically require two X chromosomes for ovarian development, and that's because there's actually some genes on the X chromosome that escape X inactivation that are involved in developing ovaries. And that's interesting because if you look at something like Turner syndrome, with women who just have one X chromosome, they're missing the second X, they can't develop complete ovaries because they don't have that double gene dosage from the double X's. And so what's going on with Klinefelter syndrome is it's probably that, most of the genes on the second X chromosome are inactive, but there are some genes that will escape X inactivation and express themselves in double copy. And that's probably why some of the issues happen in terms of men with Klinefelter syndromes, like maybe breast growth, or like higher estrogen, or lack of T specifically. I think some of those double copy genes are actually inhibiting the full testes development. And so that's why you get those issues with low T and infertility and things like that. So yeah, that's an interesting question. Nobody ever asked me that. So I've actually never thought through that specifically as it relates to Klinefelter syndrome. So that's really interesting. And I think it ties back really well to X inactivation. So I'll look that up just to double check. But if that makes sense regarding X inactivation, I think it would apply to Klinefelter syndrome, the double copy.
Okay, Interesting. Yeah, sometimes the person who doesn't know anything about the topic has the question that hasn't been asked a lot.
Yeah.
But so
Does that make sense? X inactivation?
yeah,
Okay.
I think so. So basically, every cell doesn't, or not only doesn't need, but shouldn't have both X's. So, like you said, nature
Right.
found a way of shutting down the extra one.
Right. So
Okay.
I believe from what I've read in my research, it's also random in the sense that like you take one cell, the maternal X might be silenced, but you take another cell and the paternal X might be silenced. And so it's random throughout every cell, so that you kind of get a nice shuffle of genes. So that it doesn't like silence all the maternal genes or all the paternal genes across the entire body, basically. So
Interesting. Okay. And can you explain what's going on with Caster Semenya, to use as an example,
yeah,
the athlete?
that's a good one. So that example is brought up all the time because the people who are arguing that specifically either that men should compete in women's sports, or that any DSD athlete, any athlete who has a disorder of sex development, should be able to compete as it relates to their quote unquote gender identity, so how they see themselves, regardless of what's going on in their biology. With Caster Semenya, he actually has a well. Let me back up first of all. Let me explain like how the activists often talk about it, so you can get a perspective. So with Caster Semenya, they'll say that this is a woman who has high testosterone, and the high testosterone is just because she has a disorder of sex development, and um, we shouldn't like ban women from competing because they have high testosterone. Well, the problem is it sees this completely wrong. It's completely opposite of what's actually going on. Caster Semenya does not have high testosterone because of a disorder. Caster Semenya has high testosterone because he has typical testes that can then produce male levels of T, and then he can then respond to that T through development. So it's ironic, actually, the disorder that he has nothing to do with the production of testosterone. And so he has high testosterone because he is male. He developed testes and he can respond to the T from the testes. So then you might ask, okay, well, what's the disorder? The disorder is in the conversion of T to a hormone called DHT. You can think of DHT as like this super testosterone. And what this super testosterone does is it masculinizes the male's external genitalia. So it grows the penis in utero, it descends the testes into the scrotal sac in utero. And it's that hormone, DHT, that is responsible for that final step of male sex development. So what happened with Caster is he has this disorder called 5-alpha reductase deficiency. And it is a deficiency in the enzyme that allows you to convert testosterone into DHT. So he can't produce DHT ever since he was like conceived. And so in the womb, he developed basically normal testes. He developed a normal internal male reproductive system, but it was that final step of male sex development, the development of the penis and descending of the testes into the scrotum, that was missing because he didn't have any DHT. And so that's what's actually going on with the disorder. And so he was raised as a girl, from what I could tell in my reading, and then so he came in there and was identifying as a woman, and that's the argument. They're saying that he identifies as a woman, he's just a woman with high T, but no, he's a male with normal T and just a lack of DHT. And there's some interesting research on DHT. You might ask, okay, he has normal levels of T, but he lacks DHT. So could that impact sports performance? The research on DHT and sports performance, it mostly shows that there's really not much of an impact at all on sports performance, that it's mainly the testosterone, the main hormone testosterone, and the reception of that testosterone across development, that's the main source of the advantage. Someone like Caster Semenya with 5-ARD, he is not going to have really any like lack of a performance advantage because he'll have the full effects of testosterone on his body through development. So that's Castor. that's that situation.
Okay, interesting. Really good explanation. I appreciate the plain speaking about it. Do you
Yep.
personally think it's unfair that Castor competes with women?
I do. And the reason is it's just obvious. The criteria for fairness in women's sports, for males not to compete in women's sports, would be, okay, if you have a male who has testes, the testes produce testosterone and the body receives that testosterone across development, you have the male sports performance advantage, you cannot compete. So Castor, who is a male who has 5-ARD, who receives testosterone through development, who has the male sports performance advantage, like, yeah, he should not be allowed to compete. I don't think that's fair at all. People have brought up cases, like, I'll bring up another case, well, not specific a case, but like another DSD that people will argue about. One DSD is called CAIS, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. And these fetuses develop testes, just like Castor did, but the difference is they cannot actually respond to testosterone at all because their androgen receptors don't function properly. So what happens is, even though they have internal testes, their body responds as if it has a female physiology, because a lot of the T is converted into estrogen. The body can't really deal with the T at all. And so what happens is you don't get a male sports performance advantage. You get kind of a more typical female puberty, just without menstruation and without, obviously, no egg production because there's no ovaries. But they don't have the male sports performance advantage. So in those cases, it'd be completely okay to allow them to compete in the female category. Up until recently, probably like up until the mid 1900s, we didn't even know that these women with CIS actually had internal testes and were technically males. It's just because of modern medical science with genetics and with ultrasound and things like that. Oh, we can see they have internal testes, but it doesn't provide them with any type of sports performance advantage. They develop an external body that's like just typical female. So it's just, yeah, so that's a different case where we could actually allow them to compete, whereas someone like Castor Semenya with 5-ARD, we should not allow.
Really interesting. So there's a difference between a male who was not able to have any testosterone impact on their growth at all, versus the Castor Semenya who just didn't have the DHT, the super testosterone kind of that you described.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
Okay, and there's so much misinformation about that I certainly didn't, fully understand that about Castor Semenya. And let's talk a little bit about the response you've gotten. So I know you're really active on Twitter, and sometimes it's quite funny to see you responding to some of the myths people are putting forward and the pseudoscience. And so what has it been like for you from the trans activists and from people who disagree with you?
So for the most part, I know a lot of people talk about like how they get like a lot of hate. For the most part, I don't really get like pretty much any hate mail or like hate messages. I do get people like calling me a transphobe, an intersex phobe, and all the phobes and everything. But it tends to be fairly mild for the most part compared to what other people experience. So I'm lucky in that. But I think my main experience on Twitter is mainly what I'll do is I'll quote tweet. You'll see that all the time. I'll quote tweet people who are talking nonsense, whether it's trans activists or whoever. I'll provide the scientific evidence. I'll provide like the lay person level explanation of what's going on to help educate those who are observing and watching. And I don't expect like the trans activists to change their mind at all, but most of the time they don't respond to me at all. They'll either block me or just be silent, or they will respond to me. Either they'll be really angry and then calling me those things like I said before, or they'll try to actually logically walk through their argument and kind of and I have engaged somewhat as well, like in terms of responding to their responses to me and just kind of engaging in a dialogue. But for the most part, I haven't been able to like get past their ideological perspective and kind of help like tear down the walls basically. But there have been some situations where it has worked pretty well in terms of like sometimes they actually have changed their mind. So I can give an example of that. Um, One example was back in, I think, last year or maybe 2022. I was talking to a trans activist about the difference between sex determination mechanisms and sex, and he was saying that because there's all these different chromosome disorders in males and females, like like we talked about before, like XXY and things like that. There's like 6 sexes, and so I was explaining to him, well, first of all, that's conflating the mechanisms like chromosomes that are involved in developing sex. That's conflating those with sex itself. And if you actually look at what's going on with the genetics in those chromosomes, those people with those disorders, they still develop as males or females. And I explained to him a good example is like sex determination in crocodiles, actually. And crocodiles are a good example because they don't have sex chromosomes like we do. They don't have X or Y. They don't have anything. And they just use temperature. And so a crocodile who develops at a certain temperature, like their eggs incubate at a certain temperature level, they will develop as males. And then there's another temperature level where they'll develop as females. So it's all about how the environmental temperature impacts the egg development and specifically the sex development of that fetus. And he was like, interesting. I didn't know that crocodiles didn't have sex chromosomes. And I was explaining to him, like, yeah, and that's why we can still define sex in a consistent way, because even though they don't have sex chromosomes, they still develop a body that produces sperm or a body that produces eggs. And so he was like thinking about it. He was like, huh, that's really cool. And he actually wound up saying to people that, Zach told me that this works like this now, and I understand it better now, and I take back my statement about the 6 sexes. It's like, wow, okay. So that was cool. Just using examples and walking people through the logic and like being kind but firm, and yeah, it's worked really well. So yeah.
Wow. And sorry if I didn't catch this, but was he anonymous or was he?
Yeah, he was anonymous.
Okay.
He actually had a I think a Stitch, a profile picture of Stitch, from like Lilo and Stitch.
Okay. So he was an animated
yeah.
profile.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I wondered because, if someone's anonymous, they might have less at stake or like saving face.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the thing too. That's very interesting. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
yeah.
I was just gonna say, yeah. It also is interesting that when it comes to like positive responses, I've had a lot of people saying like, man, Zach, you have the patience of a saint, because I just take so much time to like quote tweet these people, and it's fun for me, and I get to learn even deeper, and then I also get to help others, educate others. And then also I've had responses of like, I really appreciate how you talk about things in like a easy to understand way, where it's maybe a complex topic, but you help break it down in a way that was like easy to follow, easy to read. So that's always my goal too. So, and that's what good teachers do, is they are able to break things down like that, make a complex topic easy to understand, and by doing that, it also helps me like reinforce the principles and better my arguments, because if I have to explain something complex and I have to do it in a way where, just average people have to, like, without a biology education specifically, like, for them to understand, it helps so much to it forces me to, like, basically simplify things in a way that's easy to understand and walk through the logic, and it reinforces the point.
And do you ever see yourself teaching in a professional sense? Do you ever want to be a teacher or a college professor?
It's kind of like it's almost like a love and hate type thing, because I love teaching. I love like helping others, teaching others, specifically about this topic too, but I also don't really want to be in at least right now. Maybe ever. I'm not really sure. I like the freedom that I have right now too. So I just, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question, but I definitely enjoy teaching others, and so I want to continue doing that through the Paradox Institute for sure.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. Like you said, being in academia might be more stifling. Most likely, it probably would, depending where you were,
Probably.
especially compared to being independent, having your own organization. And then just another clarifying question about the chromosomes.
Yeah.
Are they in every cell of our body? Is that a true statement?
Yeah, every cell of our body will have the typical 46XX or 46XY chromosome set that us humans have, and it's through our entire body. The one exception is the fact that our specifically gonads, obviously, they produce either sperm if you're a male or eggs if you're a female. And in that sense, um, as those, for example, with males, as the sperm is dividing, as the more primordial sperm cells are dividing, they half the chromosomes. So you have, instead of diploid, which means like the two sets of chromosomes, you'll have haploid, which means just one set of chromosomes. And when that gamete creation is happening, that's the only place in the body where you'll have half the number of chromosomes as opposed to the double, like the full set of chromosomes. And obviously, just so people understand, the reason why in gamete creation that it halves the set of chromosomes is because one, it wants to half them so it can shuffle them up across different haploid cells and create gametes that all have different like chromosome slash genetic combinations, right? So you can have genetic diversity that way. But then you also have to half the number of chromosomes because you have to then link up your other gamete with the opposite sex gamete that also has half the chromosomes. So it restores the diploid number. It restores that full chromosome set for the new genetically unique individual. So that's why in the body that's the only spot where it's half.
Okay, so the only ones.
If that makes sense, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think so. So the only cells that don't have your sex fully imprinted are the ones that are going to be used for reproduction in the case of a male.
Yeah, right. Because you'd have either X for some sperm cells and then Y for other sperm cells, and that's where it actually starts to break down. Like, okay, these gamete cells now, they're not a copy of you; they're a slice of you that's been shuffled around. That's like half of you, and that type. You can think of it that way.
Okay, so like Henry VIII, when he kept having daughters, that was coming from him. That was his sex.
Ironically, it kept coming from him. Yeah, because obviously the male determines the sex in terms of like providing the X or the Y in humans. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. And let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the Paradox Institute. So tell us a little bit more about what you guys are doing with that.
So since 2020, we've expanded the type of content that we produce. We initially started with, it was just me. I just started with animated videos on sex and gender, on biological sex, on disorders of sex development. And then after I met Cynthia, PT Elephant on Twitter, we became friends, and then we fell in love and had a baby and everything. And she has been amazing at expanding our content at the Paradox Institute, and she helped bring on two other writers, Talia Nava and Sammy Stagg, who you can find on Twitter. And then we've expanded so many articles now. We've written so many articles. We have, I think, like probably 30 articles now on the Paradox Institute. You can go to theparadoxinstitute.com/read, and you can filter by even categories like dev bio, evo bio, rebuttals, gender dysphoria. We have all these different articles. And then we also have our watch page with all of our videos, and we've made some more videos since then. Then we also have a listen page for audio content. So we have some interviews that Cynthia has conducted. She's conducted interviews with a linguist professor who's against gender ideology named Alaric Nadir. She's also conducted an interview with a cosmetic surgeon, plastic surgeon specifically, Dr. Patrick Lappert, who's come out against gender ideology. She's also done interviews recently that are coming out with Joe Burgo from GenSpec, also Jennifer Law, Courage is a Habit, just a bunch of people. So we're working on getting those out too right now. And then back in last year, we started a pamphlet project, pamphlet initiative where, and I'll show you here, it's called Myths of Gender Affirming Care. And you can see it's printed by, we have Paradox Press on there. And Cynthia designed this unicorn, and what it does is it walks people through all the nonsense about gender affirming care and what all the actual facts are regarding like how harmful it is, specifically at like directed at teenagers, or information about teenagers going under cross-sex hormones, going under puberty blockers, and it just walks through the harms of puberty blockers, harms of cross-sex hormones, walks through how debunking myths regarding like the suicide statistics, how they claim that, oh, these children are going to commit suicide if they don't get cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers. So it debunks all that. Goes through kind of a review of all the studies that have been made on the harms of all this. And there's a QR code on the inner flap that will take you to the website. And the QR code has the full text from the pamphlet, and then also all the sources to back up all the different claims that we have in there. So that's our pamphlet project. And what's really cool about that is that we wound up raising $3,000 last year, and we ordered 20,000 pamphlets, and we've distributed about half of those already across the United States, across the world. There's some organizations that have been ordering a lot of them from us, like Moms for Liberty, and so people have been just using them like crazy, which is awesome. So that was actually Cynthia's idea, which was to start the pamphlet project. So without her, this huge, explosion of content probably wouldn't have happened. I would have probably been making videos still, but she's really helped like creatively expand the scope of what we're doing and expand it in a way that I just could never have imagined. It's awesome. And we have a lot more plans. I can go into that briefly in terms of what our plans are.
Yeah, go ahead, tell us.
So in regard to the pamphlet project, we want to still create more pamphlets on different topics. So one that we're going to work on soon is the basically myths of the sex spectrum, or basically like the sex binary, just showing how the sex spectrum is a myth, showing why sex is binary in a pamphlet, just like that. And then we also want to continue doing our interviews. I also want to get back into making more animated videos on biology of sex topics when I have time. And then specifically, we do have two major projects regarding like book projects. And I'm not sure when those will come out yet because they're still in like early development stages. But one is a book that Cynthia kind of brainstormed, which was called The ABCs of Sex Determination. And it's directed at adults, but it also is going to be written in a way that middle school level can understand. And what it does is it, using the alphabet A through Z, it takes you through different types of animals and different types of plants across the plant animal kingdoms. And it shows you all these diverse, really cool mechanisms that are involved in developing sex, but then shows you how sex is defined consistently across all those different mechanisms. And it will do so in like a kind of a fun way with like really cool artistic frames around the pages and almost like a traveler's guide or explorer's guide type of thing. And we're going to be using her art skills to do that. The other one is what's called basically the Sex Development Handbook. And what that is it's going to walk through all the major disorders of sex development for every spread. So a left page and a right page will just be like one disorder. It will have a discussion of what the disorder is involved, or like what's involved in the disorder. And then it will also show what causes it. And on the left, it will feature my sex development charts that I made, which walks you through visually how those different disorders develop, from chromosomes to genes to gonads to the hormones to the genitalia. So it will be a good handbook for like debunking all the myths that we see on DSDs, explaining how we define sex in all those cases. So those are the two major like book projects that we're working on. So yeah, it's we have a lot to do. um, one more thing I do want to mention too is that we want to do a video series on the menstrual cycle, and we've done a lot of research and we've written the scripts for it. It's just a matter of now recording it and animating it. But we want to basically debunk a lot of myths about the menstrual cycle while also educating people on how it works, walking through the all the three different major phases of the menstrual cycle, and for each video. So the first phase will be like video 1, second phase video 2, third phase video 3, and just going through all that biological detail. And I learned, when I was doing research for that, I learned so much about the menstrual cycle and how it works, how complex it is, how important it is for women's health too. And so that was fascinating, and so we're really excited about that as well. So a lot going on.
Excellent. Wow, sounds really good. Yeah, it's so important, the topic of the menstrual cycle. You know, I was recently interviewing Eliza Mondegreen, who's a researcher on gender, and specifically she researches online gender communities. And she was telling me about how the menstrual cycle is seen as, you know, something to get rid of. And I asked her if she had any kind of personal experience in any of these social contagion type issues. And she told me that she had dealt with anorexia when she was a teenager, and that one of the big draws for her was actually hearing that it will take away your period. So we talked a little bit about how the trans activists kind of frame the menstrual cycle as not important, or something that you can easily get rid of and just happily kind of leave behind. So that sounds really interesting and important. Why do we get so irritable right before our periods? Maybe you can answer that.
Well, let me think. So right before, just first of all, it's very interesting that people claim that you can like take it away, that it's just fine, because the problem with taking it away is that the menstrual cycle is inherently tied to various fluctuations of specific hormones throughout the whole cycle that creates a healthy balance and equilibrium. And so it's not that the equilibrium is that it's flat. The hormones are actually, the equilibrium is an actual like ebb and flow of hormones. And so when you stop that, you're stopping the natural ebb and flow of hormones that's important for a healthy physiology for females. Well, when it comes to the menstrual cycle, specifically, like why do you get irritable before, you know, periods? It's the, let me see if I can remember. It's I think what's happening is I think there is a surge in estrogen because of, let's see. Okay, I'm getting it now. I have to remember all the different phases. So with the follicular phase specifically, this is before the period starts. It's before ovulation. The follicles are growing. The eggs are being brought to maturity, and then one egg will be, or a couple eggs will be released for conception, and that rises estrogen a lot because the granulosa cells that are in the follicles are growing and replicating and producing estrogen. And so you get a surge in estrogen coming up towards close to conception. Sorry, not conception. I meant ovulation. Ovulation. And then once estrogen peaks around ovulation, and then LH also peaks, luteinizing hormone also peaks around ovulation, then the egg is released. And then basically what happens is there's a surge in progesterone that's released, especially if the egg is not fertilized. It starts to release progesterone through what's called the corpus luteum that forms from the egg basically deteriorating after being not fertilized. And so it's that surge in progesterone that then starts to basically tell the uterus to start to basically contract and like slough off the outer uterine lining, which is the endometrium, and that's the period. And so it's mainly, I think, a surge of progesterone, which might cause that. But yeah, you put me on the spot there. That was a good question.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it's worth double checking that, but let me actually just look up the cycle of hormones. I can clarify regarding progesterone. So with progesterone, what's actually happening once the egg is released, after the egg is released, there's this thing called the corpus luteum, which I mentioned. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone so that it actually builds the lining of the uterus up to prepare for a fertilized egg to then implant in the uterus. And so it's that rise of progesterone that actually causes the uterine lining to be built up more. And then what happens is when there's no fertilization, the corpus luteum basically starts to like shrivel up and doesn't produce as much progesterone. So the progesterone actually plummets before menstruation. And the estrogen also plummets before menstruation. And so a big cause of irritability is actually a flattening of the hormones, progesterone and estrogen, before menstruation. So what that tells you is that a potential cause of irritability is your hormones are basically like super low. So we often think, oh, women are super irritable before menstruation because people might say, oh, because their hormones are like going crazy, like maybe going up, right? Maybe it's like a lot of estrogen, but actually no, it's actually a flattening of progesterone and estrogen down to almost like very low levels that actually causes the irritability to a large degree. So that's interesting. So it also makes you think, well, we know that birth control pills, a lot of them also kind of flatten the hormone profile, so that could potentially cause issues as well. But yeah, it's that's really interesting. And also to clarify what I said before, I said that progesterone, like the rise in it, causes the uterine lining to slough off. It's the opposite. It's the rise in progesterone that builds the uterine lining, and then once progesterone plummets because there's no conception, it's that plummeting of progesterone that causes the uterine lining to slough off, and that's when you have a period. So
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to people who end up doing steps of medical transition and they'll get, what is euphemistically called the bottom surgery. So they'll have sometimes the women will have a hysterectomy or the men will have their testicles removed. And why is it that these people then have to be on hormones for life?
So when because basically the gonads, if the gonads are removed, they basically have to be on hormones for life because the gonads, the ovaries, and the testes, since they formed in the womb around the 7th week or so, those gonads produce sex-specific hormones, specific levels of estrogen for specific levels of estrogen and testosterone for females, specific levels of estrogen and testosterone for males, and those are sex specific. So your body, if you're a male, since you have been in the womb, has been bathed in specific levels of testosterone and estrogen that fluctuate at certain times of development and stay at a certain level through development as well. And so your body tissues are basically organized around that hormone level. Even your bones as well. And there's components of testosterone and estrogen that are important for bone maintenance, healthy tissue development, healthy tissue maintenance across your body, functioning of organs. And again, those levels of testosterone and estrogen are specific to males versus females. So males and females both need estrogen and testosterone, it's just we need different levels of it. And if you take away the gonads completely, you don't have that steady stream of hormones, and basically it's basically like inducing an endocrine disorder, and that's why you have to be on hormones for the rest of your life if you want to have like healthy functioning bodily systems, because you got to basically replace those important hormones that were being provided by the gonads.
Okay. And I've talked to a couple of detransitioners who suffer from osteoporosis at a young age, and I know that's something that has been occurring. Why does that? I know because you mentioned it affects the bones. So why is it that someone who transitions might end up with something like osteoporosis?
Yeah, well, one aspect is like, for example, estrogen. Estrogen is important for bone maintenance and bone health. in both males and females. And specifically when it comes to females, if you're taking away a lot of their estrogen, that bone maintenance, ceases to happen as much. It's not as well maintained. And then you're giving them testosterone, so it's not creating the healthy environment for their bone development based on what their development has experienced, all their life. And then there's also the component of at puberty, estrogen is important as well for bone growth and the growth plate and the fusion of the growth plate, where then you stop growing after it fuses. Basically, that's important as well. So if you take away estrogen, if you just block that, if you block the correct levels of testosterone in males at that stage as well, it blocks those developmental processes with the bones from happening. Bone growth is definitely really tied to bone growth and bone maintenance is very tied to sex hormones for sure, and the specific levels for males and females. So that's why, yeah, it's awful taking it away.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't know that, especially young people who are looking to go down this path. And to kind of shift gears a little bit, I'm curious your thoughts about kind of the question of speaking up on these topics. So I know you said you don't get a lot of hate, which is good. And has anyone ever tried to cancel you, though? And also, I guess it's a two-part question. And what do you advise people who, let's say maybe they are in academia and they want to speak up about these things, but they feel like they might receive some blowback socially or academically, professionally, one of those things?
The first question, I haven't really had anybody try to cancel me. Like, nobody's like reached out to my employer or anything like that. I'm also very careful of like the employers that I choose. So I try not to go to any place that's like a woke place that's like balanced, that seems to appreciate free speech. And so I've been fine there. And then when it comes to like other types of like trying to cancel me, there's been trans activists who have always tried to harp on the fact that I have an architecture degree, not a biology degree, and so I have no business speaking about any of this, and they think that they can just completely like cancel me that way. But that hasn't worked because I provide all the evidence for my claims. I'm also very logical and reasonable. I walk through my claims in detail, back them up, and they're backed up with evidence, and they're the truth. And so it hasn't been effective at all. And my followers or people who may not even agree with everything I say have always backed me up too by saying, like, it doesn't matter what degree this guy has. Like, what matters is his argument true or not? Is it backed up by evidence or not? And that usually makes them quiet because they don't have any response to that, because they want to go through the appeal to authority route, and it doesn't work because it's not a logical argument. It doesn't make their case at all. It just shows you that they're grasping at straws. If they had a good case to make, they would make it, but they don't. And so that's one aspect. Your other question in regards to like advice for people who like maybe academics who want to speak out, but for one aspect, it depends on the situation. I understand people wanting to keep their jobs, like their livelihood is very important. And, I wouldn't want people to lose that. At the same time, there's also a cost of not speaking out as well. There's a cost of like, either you feel like your conscience can't rest because you haven't spoken out and that's eating away at you, or the cost of having to stay silent and not have your voice out there in terms of like giving other people the courage to speak out, because it is like a domino effect. When more and more people start to speak out, it makes it easier for others to do so. So that could be a con as well. And then I guess the other con is, I don't know, the ways your life can take you if you speak out and speak the truth. Like, there's a lot of positive aspects to doing that, and it might really it might change your life in a positive way by speaking out as well. So it's a tough situation, but I would definitely always err on the side of speaking out, or at least not participating. Because even if you don't speak out, if you're participating, like going to events that like host lectures on like the sex spectrum or whatever it is, like and you're like going there in support of it, or at least going there because you feel like you have to, like that's not good. Like just stop doing that. At least stop participating in like all the lies. If you're a medical practitioner, just stop participating in the lies. If it goes against your conscience, stop participating in it. You don't have to necessarily speak out. It's just, granted, even if you don't speak out, they might still come after you for not doing what they want, right? But again, I think it's better overall to speak out, or at least not participate, than not do anything at all. So
yeah, it's like Jordan Peterson says, you got to pick your poison, right? So
yeah.
No matter
exactly.
which way you take, there are going to be pitfalls, but you have to choose what feels okay to you. And also, I liked your point about how you have truth on your side. And that is another thing that Jordan Peterson talks about a lot, which is that people who try to twist the fabric of reality, it always bounces back and smacks them. I mean, he said that in his years as a clinical psychologist, he said he never saw anyone get away with anything. And it took me a while to kind of chew that one over, think about what he meant by that. But I think he meant that people who use falsehoods and deceit and try to manipulate reality, they cannot ultimately get away with it, whatever way that ends up.
No.
I don't know exactly how that will look.
Yeah, it's really true. I mean, think about like the activists who believe that cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers are like healthy. Like reality is hitting them in the face with all the damaging things that have been happening to children, even damages to their own body. These activists who push this stuff too, and who do that and take those artificial hormones, like reality is fighting back against them and actually damaging their body. And it's even if you do something in your life that's like wrong or against your conscience, maybe even if it doesn't have like external consequences that you can see, either it does have external consequences that you don't see, or it has internal consequences on you and your conscience and your health, the health of your psychology. Like there's always a cost. So yeah.
Absolutely, there's always a cost. I think that's a good place to maybe start to wrap up. Zach, thank you so much. To everyone watching and listening, consider getting binary. And, like Zach said, there are sources at the end of every chapter, also little summaries of the chapters, and it can really help if you're trying to muddle through all these arguments that are being made about why sex is not binary. And is there anything you want to close on or leave us with, Zach, before we end?
I would just go to theparadoxinstitute.com, and you can access all of our resources and materials there. And you can also reach me at ZAE Lefty on Twitter, and you can DM me, ask me a question. I try to respond sometimes, but it's hard to keep up with the DMs and stuff. But also just tag me on Twitter too, and you can ask me a question or anything. So yeah, thanks for your time, Sasha, and yeah, thanks for supporting us at the Paradox Institute and all we do, and giving me the opportunity to talk about everything. It's been awesome.
Excellent. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and hopefully we'll get to talk again sometime.